So we draw a conclusion based on how small the p-value is. Okay? The smaller it is, the more evidence we have against the null. We can phrase the conclusion in terms of how much evidence against the null we have. In the sleep example, we're asking how much evidence there is that students aren't getting enough sleep on average. Just on average, we're not talking about each individual student, we're saying what's the average amount of sleep that people get, are we not getting enough on average? In terms of measuring how much evidence there is against the null, I guess, here's just a rough guide on where you might fall on that. If your p-value is point something, you don't really have like 0.2, 0.3, 0.1, then you don't really have much evidence against the null. Your data is quite compatible with the null. If your data is 0.0 something, then, well, there's kind of some sort of moderate evidence against the null. Maybe something's going on, but we're not really sure. If it's 0.00 something, you'd say you have strong evidence. If it's 0.000 something, you've got very strong evidence against the null. That's like a rough rule for how I interpret p-values, usually. Some people talk about 0.05 as a critical level. So if you're asked to do a test at the 0.05 level, then you would conclude that you have evidence against the null at the 0.05 level if your p-value is smaller than 0.05. Okay, so in the sleep example, is like 1 in a million, really, really small. It's like getting 20 heads in a row. If I was tossing coin, got like 10 heads in a row, you'd all get bored and leave. 20 heads is ridiculous. So we have very strong evidence here against the null hypothesis. Our data is not compatible with the null. This is like a 1 in a million class. They're either like super light sleepers, 1 in a million class, or this hypothesis was wrong. And if we're using our data to try and test this hypothesis, we would say these data provide some very strong evidence. Very strong evidence that on average, students aren't getting enough sleep.